This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin today's show joined by K-State Assistant Professors in Agricultural Communications, Nellie Hill and Katie Starzec. Today they share with us insight on a recent study looking at soil health practice adoption by Kansas producers. Also ahead, prairie strips go by several different names, including conservation strips and floral enhancements. But no matter what you call them, they have a multitude of impacts. Tania Kim, K-State Assistant Professor in Entomology, joins us for a conversation on her work looking at the use of prairie strips to encourage beneficial insects, specifically with soybeans. We end with this week's Milk Lines, where K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk shares information on short forage season options to help bridge the gap between the 2022 crop and the harvesting of the 2023 crop. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by two assistant professors here at K-State in our Department of Agricultural Communications. So we have with us today Nellie Hill and Katie Starzec, and they're joining us today to talk about soil health practice adoptions in Kansas. So before we even get started, thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks, Sam.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start slowly incorporating some more ag-com subjects. And I heard about this study recently that you guys conducted. And like I said, it focuses on soil health practice adoption. So what really inspired the study? What was the purpose of it?
Well, we applied for funding through Kansas Natural Resources Conservation Service because we recognize that there is a lot of great science research going on in the state related to soil, related to water, related to wildlife habitat and conservation in general. But with the state being so about 98% privately owned, we know that it really comes down to the landowner and the operator's decisions to implement conservation practices. So we really need to know more and more about people, their decision-making processes, the barriers that get in the way, and what their motivations are to implement conservation practices in order to get this great science on the ground.
Absolutely. And we'll talk through a lot of this further. But these soil health practices, I think one of the things that scares people is just the cost, the upfront cost. And Nellie, you were telling me beforehand, before we went on air, that producers that have implemented this, they're finding that, the costs end up being an investment of sorts because it pays off in the end.
That's exactly right. We often hear that discussion, and it's one of the barriers that we identified in our research, of course, is that the financial concern or concern about that investment really keeps people from implementing a practice. But what we found in talking to land managers is that once they implement those practices, they really see the evidence pay off for them. Of course, there is a cost, but oftentimes they talk about an increase in their profitability because of implementing a soil health practice on their property. So they really end up going hand in hand.
Wonderful. Well, we talk about soil health practices all the time on the show, it feels like, whether it's taking soil samples and actually adjusting what you need or cover crops or different things like that. So this is supplementation to those conversations to kind of convince producers, hey, others are successfully doing this, but here are some of the challenges they faced and maybe even how they overcame some of them. So let's get into some of the findings of this study. I guess beginning with what really were people most interested in when it came to soil health practices? What were the main topics?
We did a survey and we got a few hundred responses back to the survey. And the top practices that Kansas producers who responded want to implement next are grazing livestock on cover crops, which is not that surprising, but good to hear. Either starting cover crops or expanding their cover crop efforts, along with crimping, intercropping. So those were the top practices that people wanted to try next or try initially. And then barriers to those practices included, the top three barriers were input cost, concerns about input costs, concerns about profitability, and then also just wanting to learn more about that practice before they try it. So that was just the know-how and the information availability was a barrier for some.
Yeah, I mean, that makes complete sense. That goes with anything in life, before you kind of jump off the cliff with something, you want to make sure you fully understand it beforehand. Our producers are smart people. They know how to properly implement these things and learn more beforehand, so that makes sense completely. So when we talk through these barriers, a lot of these are things that, producers either have successfully overcome or things that they realized weren't as hard to get through as they thought. So what were some of the findings that you heard, the feedback you heard from producers in getting over those barriers?
What the folks that we talked to said, first, they really pointed to a close community where they could brainstorm, they could go out and look at a pasture or look at a field and work with neighbors or other like-minded folks that maybe they met at a conference and really brainstorm how they could work together. So using a community network to support these endeavors, implementing these practices. They also really thought of implementing soil health practices as part of the larger system of their operation and how it could make it easier for them to operate with lower inputs of all kinds because of implementing one of these practices. And really what they're looking for is evidence. So if a producer could see evidence on a neighbor's field, especially someone close and in their region, someone who's getting the same amount of rainfall as they are, if they could see that evidence on the ground, they were more likely to have that confidence to give something a try. They really were interested in dipping their toes in on these practices, seeing some evidence, and then have plans to grow and implement additional practices in the future.
Another interesting thing that we had great discussions with producers about was this aspect of social norms. Overcoming the fear of what others may think of you when you're trying something new and potentially failing or not doing it perfectly the first time. We talked to producers who would trial a new practice in the back pasture so that no one would see if it didn't work out exactly the way they had planned it. So many of the people that we talked to spoke about a concern about their neighbors talking negatively about them or people thinking that they're failing when they're just trying new things and experimenting, and they want that freedom to experiment without being judged.
That social aspect, really interesting. I would have never even thought of that. But I also think of some of the leading examples of experimentation that we partner with here at K-State, like Flickner Innovation Farms. What a great example of, trying new things and not being afraid to put your foot out there and kind of explore that. And a great opportunity to help maybe lean on your community members and say, hey, maybe this is working for me. I could help you maybe talk through how it worked for us and how you could maybe implement it too. Awesome. So this is a great conversation facilitator and building community. And I think you guys also got feedback on resources that these producers used as well during this time, right?
Yeah. So we talked with the producers about where they're finding the information, what kind of information they're looking for, and probably many of your listeners know exactly how hard it is to find some regionally specific information to them. And that's why that community building is so important, to find a network of folks who are trying the things that you want to try and getting engaged. So much information is out there, but it can be difficult to sift through it. And that's something we as communicators need to develop and continue to work on, while also helping producers to network and build that community aspect so that we can all continue helping each other.
Absolutely. Well, I'm trying to think when it comes to encouraging producers, at the end of the day, when you summarize this study, what are some final takeaways that if you could offer listeners right now, like, hey, this is a great opportunity. Why aren't you doing it? What would be some final words of advice that you would share with them?
I guess I would say if you're considering it, find someone to talk to. Find someone who can show you the difference it's made or not made on their operation, and really seek out that evidence, because that seemed to be a really crucial change point for many producers, that once they saw it or were able to talk to someone who could give them that evidence, that really motivated them and pushed them forward, giving it a try, even on a small amount of land, giving a little bit of a try, see if you can see a difference. It might work for you, and then you've put, very little into it and can either pull out or give it an expansion. So that would be my recommendation.
I guess I would say that not everyone is ready to implement conservation practices or soil health related practices all at the same time. So it's just really important to remember that no matter where you are in the decision-making process, you can find a friend, jump on board, get more information, and implement these practices at your own pace for when it works for you and for when you have the appropriate resources that you need.
It really goes back to what is soil health, and that's increasing the vitality of the soil to continue to produce food, fiber, and conserving our natural resources. So any practice that we can implement that's good for us as producers and good for the soil is a win in the end of the day.
Absolutely. Yeah. You guys have mentioned inputs becoming, more and more of a concern for producers. And we have specialists here at K-State that emphasize that this is a great way every time they speak with me to kind of help mitigate those issues and those concerns with input prices. And I think when it comes to cover crops and things of this nature, soil health, I have two specialists that really come to my mind, and that's Peter Tomlinson and Deanne Presley. And they are both fantastic resources. So if those of you tuning in are looking for K-State experts to talk to you about soil health practices and concerns with that, they are excellent resources for sure. But also lean on your community members because that's a great way to learn as well. Nellie and Katie, I can't thank you enough for coming in today and for helping lead this conversation and provide so much insight. So hopefully this inspired some producers out there to get active in their community and maybe even to, dip their toes in the water of soil health practices. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us, Sam.
Yep. Thanks, Sam.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Nellie Hill and Katie Starzec. They are both assistant professors in ag communications here at K-State. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we return, we're almost continuing this conversation on soil health practices with Tania Kim. She's an assistant professor in entomology here at K-State, and she's joining us to discuss prairie strips for beneficials in Kansas. It's an area of research that she has recently brought to Kansas in the last several years and has done research looking at the various benefits that prairie strips provide, not only through insects, but also in water conservation, as well as soil health. So stay tuned for that conversation because we'll be back with that and more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. I'm joined now by Tania Kim. She is an assistant professor in entomology here at K-State, and she's joining us today for a conversation on prairie strips for beneficials. It's an area of research that she's been working on here in the last several years. And prairie strips go by several different names, which we'll get into here in a moment. But first and foremost, Tania, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, like I said, your research as of late has been focusing on prairie strips for beneficials, but we were chatting beforehand and you said prairie strips are also known by many other names too, right?
Right. We call them prairie strips because it's kind of self-explanatory when you hear that name, but they also go by conservation strips, floral enhancements. Some people confuse prairie strips with buffer strips or hedgerows, but the difference there is that we're talking about forbs and grasses versus trees and exclusively grasses and grassy waterways. But you'll hear conservation strips used interchangeably with prairie strips quite a bit.
Awesome. So I know that this research, you were saying beforehand, this has been around for a long time. There's been different universities that have looked at the benefits of these, but you wanted to really bring that to Kansas, right?
Exactly. So Iowa State has this very large strips project where they've done experiments as well as work with growers about the numerous benefits of these conservation strips or these prairie strips. It enhances water quality, it reduces soil erosion, it increases carbon sequestration, so it keeps the carbon in the ground, so that's great for climate change. And they've also looked at the benefits for wildlife like birds as well as beneficials. So they've been kind of leading the field in terms of research and application. Michigan State has recently joined looking at how these prairie strips might benefit them. Michigan has a lot of pollinator-dependent crops, and so they're primarily looking at how can we bring pollinators to our fields and support them in a sustainable way. So I'm interested in it from a different perspective. We live in a very dry climate, and just because, there are lots of benefits in Iowa and Michigan, I wanted to see if the same thing would happen in our drier landscapes in Kansas.
Obviously, our crops differ a bit from Michigan, but probably a little bit more similar to Iowa. So you've been looking at the use of prairie strips specifically with soybeans, right?
Correct, yes. So I think the concept can also work for other crops like wheat and corn. I'm interested in soybean because, there could be that added benefit of increasing pollination, whereas wheat and corn doesn't necessarily need pollinators. But also, there's a number of insects that are brought in, beneficial insects, that can reduce pests in soybean.
Absolutely. So, yeah, you've mentioned these beneficials. They can consist of pollinators, predators that consume other pests, but then decomposers too, right, is kind of a third element that people might not think of.
Right. So, a lot of ground beetles, dung beetles, ants are great decomposers. And so the same concept of we can attract them with these prairie strips, and there's that potential to sort of spill over into the agricultural field and help with removing some of that litter, decomposition as well.
Yeah, maybe even some weed benefit too, preventing
Right.
weeds.
Yes. So my student has been looking at ground beetles, and ground beetles are great generalists. They feed on other insects, but they can also feed on seeds of weeds. So there's that potential for weed control as well.
Excellent. Well, lots of great uses, it sounds like. And, we've talked through all the benefits so far, but when people are thinking about implementing their own conservation or prairie strips, I think sometimes people are like, well, I don't really know what to plant in these situations. So what have you been looking at?
Right. So fortunately, Iowa State has a lot of resources about where to start. And they advise some seed mixtures that are available through various companies and organizations like the NRCS. So these are very high diversity mixtures. So you want to plant as many forbs and perennial grasses as possible. And the key thing here is that you want perennial plants that will flower throughout the season. So a kind of a mixture so that they provide season-long floral resources for those insects.
Wonderful. So long-term benefits, not just thinking for a short season. You
Correct.
Want these to be year-round almost.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, if we're thinking about producers implementing these in their own practices, if you could leave with one word of advice on why they should, what would your closing remarks be on that?
Sure. I think there's just a multitude of benefits for these prairie strips. I think it is somewhat of an investment in time just because it takes a few years for those prairie strips to establish. But I think, at least from the beneficial insects perspective, there's that potential for increased pest suppression, which means less insecticide being sprayed. Again, if your crop relies on pollination, I think there's that added benefit. So you don't have to bring in honeybees or anything like that. You'll just kind of rely on the wild bees. So again, that's something that I'm focused on, but there are so many other benefits. And so I think it's worth at least investigating and doing some research to see if you can do that in your fields.
Yeah, slowly implementing, maybe not taking on, your entire acreage, but maybe
Right.
just a small plot of it at a time.
Exactly. Yes. Prairie strips can be implemented along the border. So sometimes they're called border strips. Iowa State has been great in that they've been looking at the benefits of sort of planting them along contour lines within the fields. So growers can decide where they want to put it depending on the slope of their land and some of their sort of challenges.
You mentioned earlier, the implementation, the upfront cost, but this is something that hopefully in the long run helps decrease input prices on other areas, like you mentioned with, mitigating pests and things like that. But over time, is this something that you're continually having to actively work towards? It's perennial, right?
Right. So there is some management, much like our natural prairies. There is, mowing that's going to have to be done or prescribed burns. So that is required sort of on an annual basis. So it's not exactly leave it and let it sort of be because, again, that litter will accumulate. A lot of those forbs will have a hard time flowering in the summertime. So you do have to manage it. But I feel that it's not that much compared to the alternative, which is actively spraying, tilling, or, spraying herbicides.
Absolutely. Yeah. So a great option for those of you that are interested in maybe exploring this a little bit more and experimenting with implementing it at your own operation. But Tania, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you coming in and speaking with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And if people are tuning in and they're looking for more resources on this area, where might be a good starting point for them?
Yeah. So I think, again, the Iowa State Strips Project, it just has a bunch of resources there. They have information for growers. There's links to scientific papers that have shown the benefits of these prairie strips. You can certainly go to my website. There'll be a little bit more information about what's been done here. But yeah, we're just sort of beginning to implement that in Kansas. So our, information is probably not as well developed as Iowa State. But for anybody that's really interested in the idea, I suggest going to the Iowa State Strips Project.
Well, I'll link to all of those resources in our show notes, which can be found on agtoday.net as always. But once again, Tania, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Everyone, that was Tania Kim. She's an assistant professor in entomology here at K-State, joining us for a conversation on prairie strips for beneficials in Kansas. Before we cut to a short break, a quick word from Mary Marsh, one of our friends with the Kansas Wheat Commission. She's joining us for a quick word on the Farm Bill and some updates around that in the wheat community.
Now is the time for wheat farmers to make their priorities known as negotiations for the next farm bill kick into high gear. That was a clear message from lawmakers and association staff alike during the 2023 Kansas Commodity Classic. As the calendar turns to a new month, Kansas Wheat is carrying forward that call to action as staff and board members join counterparts from across the country for joint meetings of the U.S. Wheat Associates and National Association of Wheat Growers. If you're participating in COG, your voice is being heard, said Shana DeGroat, COG Director of Membership and Governmental Affairs. We're the ones relaying messages to congressional offices and our national association. So if you're a part of COG, you can have that discussion with us to ensure that you have all the tools you need in your operation, especially to stay afloat in times of need. The 2023 Kansas Commodity Classic, the annual convention of Kansas corn, wheat, soybean, and grain sorghum associations on January 27 in Salina, farmers from across the state heard a market update from Dan Maltby with Maltby Risk Management, a U.S. Agriculture in 2023 projection presentation from AgriPulse Communications publisher Sarah Wyant, U.S. Senate updates from Senator Jerry Moran and Senator Roger Marshall. A virtual House update panel featuring all 4 members of the Kansas congressional delegation and a Farm Bill Farm Programs update from the National Association staff. The agenda was packed with valuable information, but DeGroat highlighted the need for educating staff or congressional members that are unfamiliar with agricultural issues and the potential difficulties of the current political situation in passing the next farm bill. There are fewer agriculture leaders working on the farm bill, so we have to get a lot of education to do it, DeGroat said. There may be a struggle to agree on some issues and get everything pushed through, so we need to be sure our voices are heard and we're laying information for our farmers. As an important part of the gather and convey policy process, COG members meet one day ahead of statewide events to discuss and debate policies impacting wheat growers, including approving 2 new resolutions passed by the COG Board of Directors. Both resolutions are intended to help provide additional flexibility and benefits to Kansas wheat farmers, especially during drought or other adverse conditions. Read the full set of COG resolutions at kswheat.com/COG resolutions. COG is proud to help address wheat farmers' needs in the upcoming growing season and farm bill negotiations, DeGroat said. DeGroat and Kansas wheat farmers carried these resolutions and concerns with them to Washington, D.C. this week, where they and Kansas wheat commissioners are participating in joint winter meetings for U.S. Wheat and NOG. As a part of those meetings, the Kansas group will meet with the entirety of the Kansas congressional delegation to provide additional insights on priorities for Kansas wheat growers for the next farm bill, including the new resolutions passed last week. We're excited to get on the Hill, DeGroat said. It's really important that you're involved in your state organization like COG so that we can lobby for issues like protecting crop insurance and work on issues affecting farmers in different areas of the state. We urge you to become part of COG so we can ensure your voice is heard by the folks writing the policies that will directly impact your operation. Renew or sign up for COG membership today and stay informed as farm bill negotiations progress. Learn more or pay for your membership at kswheat.com/COG. With Kansas Wheat, this is Mary Marsh.
Once again, that was a Farm Bill update from Mary Marsh with the Kansas Wheat Commission. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Well, we end today's program with this week's milk lines. As the 2022 crop forage begins to dwindle, dairy producers need to be thinking about short-season forage options, which can help bridge the gap between the 22 crop and the harvesting of the 23 crop. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk covers several short-season forages that provide dairy producers an excellent opportunity to supplement forage supplies while adding flexibility to forage production systems. However, he says the yield and nutritive value from these forages is dependent on several factors, including timing and management.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some options for spring forage crops. As we look at our dwindling supplies of forage from 2022, might be time to think about what we could do for a short-term supply of forages to carry us through the spring and early summer, before we get to that first cutting of alfalfa. And as we look at the supply of hay and the price of hay, it probably forces us to even look at these things a little bit harder than what we normally do. So what are some options? And we do have actually quite a few options out there. One of the popular ones is actually spring oats. You could harvest that either as a hay crop or a silage crop. If harvested as a hay crop with adequate fertilization and moisture, you could harvest as much as 5 tons of hay per acre. So it seems like that might be viable on some of our acres, and it would be one of the earlier crops we could plant. would need to be planted in late February or into March. And obviously it just depends on what we have available for open days to plant as well as moisture following planting. But it is a viable option. Now, one thing you need to consider if you're planting this following corn is whether or not you used atrazine or an atrazine-type product to control weeds in the corn crop. Oats are fairly sensitive to carryover from atrazine, so I would encourage you to visit very carefully with an agronomist if you did use atrazine or atrazine-type products for control of weeds on corn acres in 2022, and you're thinking about planting spring oats in 2023. Now, there are some other things that you can consider planting as well. Cereal rye is something that could also be planted in the spring and harvested as a forage crop. It also can be planted fairly early and would have a yield similar to what we might see with spring oats. However, the quality may not be quite as great. So if you're looking for something to feed to your lactating cows, you might want to consider spring oats, or you might want to consider spring triticale. It also could be planted in the spring, again, harvested a little bit later than spring oats typically. You could harvest that as well as either a hay crop or a silage crop. And the yield on that could be a little bit greater actually than spring oats. We sometimes see the hay yield of about 6 to 7 tons to the acre with spring triticale. Now, one of the things you might need to think about is the fact that its harvest will be a little bit later than something like spring oats. So, depending on what you're going to be following your spring forage crop with, that might be a consideration. So, spring oats may fit better than spring triticale, particularly if you're planning on returning those acres to corn. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider their options when it comes to spring forage crops. And again, we're just looking for something to kind of tide us over, fill in the gaps that are left from the drought season that we had in 2022.
Thanks, Mike. And just a reminder that there is still time to register for the 2023 Women Managing the Farm Conference. It's being held next week in Manhattan, February 15th through the 17th. Presentations will cover a variety of topics, including farm finances, agricultural and estate law, crop production and marketing, management, farm succession, direct marketing foods in Kansas, and much more. For more information, including costs and registration, visit womenmanagingthefarm.com or agmanager.info. That's womenmanagingthefarm.com or agmanager.info. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.